Hi, everybody. Giving everyone a couple minutes to get into the webinar. Good morning. Welcome to Click-12, a webinar series that we at FIU Online have put together for you, our teachers. My name is Leah Provolis, Interim Assistant Vice President at FIU Online, education advocate and parent of elementary school age children. At FIU Online, we value education and the quality of the student experience, all the while delivering instruction where the student and the instructor may be separated by time, space, or both in the culmination of our fully online courses. The separation by time and/or space from our students is something that educators experienced overnight this past spring, when due to COVID, our school campuses were made unavailable to us to deliver instruction. And as true heroes in education, you did it. Many of you graduated your kindergarten classes virtually or sent off your high school seniors with virtual graduations. And now here we are in the middle of summer, your most needed time off, and over 1,900 of you and your peers are signed up for this series. That truly speaks to your dedication. What we hope we can share with you during this time together are valuable best practices and guidelines that we have picked up over our 20 years in distance learning. These tips and tools are intentionally presented to you through a K-12 lens. Through your journey this coming year, remind yourself, this is a pivotal time in the world and in history, full of uncharted territory. Be kind to yourself in those challenging moments. Know that your students are very lucky to have you in their corner. And now, let's welcome our first presenter, Gabby Alvarez, Director of Learning Design and Innovation at FIU Online, who today will share with you her secrets in creating a resilient digital classroom.
Good morning. Buenos dias. Before we get started, I just want to make a quick mention about the chat features, right? So if you see towards the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a chat function, and that will allow you to speak to all the folks here today and to myself, although I'll be very honest, there feels like it's a lot going on. So I will take a look at the chat sporadically. And then you'll also notice the question and answer button. So those questions will come directly to me, and hopefully we'll have some time towards the end to go over some questions. Like Leah said, I'm Gabby Alvarez. I oversee the learning design team at FIU Online. We are the centralized unit at Florida International University who supports online course and program development, and specifically the learning design team works with instructors to bring their online and blended courses to life. But enough about us. Let's talk about you all for a minute. It was a heck of an end of a school year, huh? So before we get started, let's do a little something for you. Stick out your hand like this. Come on, wave at me. Yep, do it. And now take that hand and put it over your opposite shoulder and pat yourself on the back. It was really quite the shift. And while I know you all made it because you're here today already thinking about how you'll do it again, let's be honest. At the end of the school year, it very much felt like this. Between having to uproot your working environment and the pressure of figuring out new tools, the frustration of trying to translate your instructional strategies into some sort of digital form, not to mention missing your students, it was tough. In fact, no one quite encapsulated the feeling quite like Lizzie Smith, a music teacher out of Texas.
Hey, so as some of you guys might know, I'm a music teacher, and I found that one of the best ways that I can process the whole transition to online learning and teaching is to write a song. So I wrote a song. I'd like to share that with you guys now. Here we go.
That gets me every time. I know that it was widely spread, but I hope it's new to some of you all. Anyway, this feeling put to music, frankly, feels like it might have been universal. But I think what's important about that, right, is to deconstruct what caused some of those feelings in order to do it a little different going forward. So let's take a look at that a little bit. In emergency virtual teaching, we leveraged whatever technology we had at our disposal and moved swiftly to deliver what we had originally designed as an in-classroom learning experience. And given the emergency nature of the situation, in most cases, we were forced to make do with what we had. So in some cases, in some schools and school systems, that meant that you had a basic suite of tools, of digital tools, like a learning management system, perhaps a synchronous conferencing tool, at your disposal, but largely weren't necessarily integrating it into your classroom. And in a lot of realities, schools and school systems had to scramble to secure contracts for tools to make it work, forcing you as the educator to adapt, first by having to learn the technology, and then by having to retrofit your instructional strategies into whatever tools were available to you. But when we think about teaching, online teaching and learning, we consider the situational factors of time, distance, space in advance and account for them in the lesson design without sacrificing teaching or interaction. And while I recognize that much of the research on online education has been conducted in the higher ed space, we can certainly use it as a jumping off point to prepare and enhance our blended and virtual teaching practices in K-12 in the fall. So the first thing I need you to hear, right, is good teaching is good teaching. And contrary to the narrative that we hear today, good teaching can be done virtually and online. But the transition from our physical classrooms must be intentional and by design. My hope for our time today is to give you some recommendations and ideas on how to move your good teaching practices to the virtual or blended classroom. But here's my disclaimer. Our time today is more of a crash course and not necessarily immersion. It's not structured by early childhood, middle grades, high school, special education, but it is meant to help you think about your own classroom and how your teaching practices can translate into these modalities with reduced friction and frustration and improve time on task for your students. So let's get started. Think about how much time you spent doing tech support related activities during your initial switch to virtual teaching in the spring. What's my password? Where am I supposed to log in? Where's the homework sheet? Technology, particularly when it's not working well, has a way of creeping in and stealing the limelight from teaching. So we are going to start a quick conversation now on how you should structure your digital classroom. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this as there's an entire session dedicated to this in this series, but I do want to give you some overarching tips as you begin to plan and think about your new school year. I, as I'm sure you, would prefer to spend the majority of your time engaging in teaching and learning activities and not logistics. But this means that creating a seamless user experience is important because a poorly designed class site or too many sites or dispersed information is going to move your learners' attention from your content to navigating the different tech tools or tech systems that you're going to be using. So here are some things to keep in mind when developing your online classroom site. Stick to one main hub of communication. Believe me when I tell you, the platform will not make or break the learning experience. Sure, there are learning management systems that are fancier than others. And if you're lucky enough to work in a school or a school system that has a learning management system, take some time to get to know it. It will make your life easier as an educator. But in a lot of cases, you may not have the luxury of having access to a learning management system or having been a part of the decision-making process of what system you're on. But what's important to keep in mind is that what will derail your teaching and learning experience, the teaching and learning experience, is not establishing a consistent location for students to find what they need and to know where they need to go to be successful in their classroom. This should be one main place where students can access information on your schedule, your assignments, your grading rubrics, communication, all of it. Even if you're using multiple systems, there should be the central hub. So even if you're going to ask them to jump into a separate system, they should always be logging into one place, right? And it should be directing them, whether by your instructions or by the daily worksheet, right? It should then funnel them to the next space. But that way it builds familiarity of where it is that they need to go. Similar how you would start your day with your students when they showed up to your classroom. Once you've chosen that platform, stick to it. Alerts, reminders should always point them back to that main hub, right? So it's similar to, if we think about it, in our face-to-face or in our classrooms, there's a lot of norms that are built into our behaviors and what we're supposed to do that in the online environment, we didn't have time to do when this happened in the spring. That's what you should be establishing now. Let them know how and where they should be reporting to and where they should be looking for information. Think about the layout of your content. Make it consistent, logical, and efficient. While there are a lot of different ways to do that, keep in mind that the layout of your course and content materials should probably be corresponding to your teaching. So I've seen a few sites with some colleagues that have asked me to look at, what they're preparing. So sometimes, depending on the discipline, they might group all the cold readings together, right? And so then what you've done, so all the cold reads are together, all the weekly to-do lists are together. Instead, my recommendation is to perhaps group those in by week, right? So that the student is not having to, depending on what system they're on, look for all the different materials that they're going to need in one week in several places. And I'll show you an example of that. Test the navigation of your course site. So if you are using a learning management system, most learning management systems do offer a student view that you, as not the editor, right, not the teacher, can see how they are seeing your information. Test your course site that way. And if you don't have it, either way, ask someone to look at your course navigation and test them. Say, can you find my weekly sheets this way? Or depending on your discipline or the student's grades or how you've structured it, if your person who is helping you kind of understand whether or not you've designed an efficient and logical class site, it has a hard time with something, consider that feedback and think about how you might be able to further clarify so that the student is not stuck navigating all the different pieces that you might be trying to communicate to them. Finally, you're not tech support, or maybe you are, right? Regardless, let them know who and where to find support on the systems that you're using. So for example, if you are using reflex math, right, to reinforce multiplications and addition and subtraction, if that contract with your school or your school system has tech support built in it, when you've given them the information about that site and their password, also give them the tech support information. It's amazing how much kids can actually how to be able to ask for that kind of help and support, right? Because we recognize that they are in other systems, perhaps not educational-based systems, but when they're trying to figure out how to reset their PS4 password, they can pretty much figure that out regularly, right? So, empower them to also problem solve as they use, when they're using the technology in your classroom. All right, so here are two screenshots from Google Docs. Now, I know my educators who are tech savvy out there are thinking, why is she showing Google Docs? Not everybody has the luxury of having the sophisticated learning management systems that some of us might have access to, right? And so the point of my slide here is to show you that regardless of the system that you're on, it's how we as the educator utilize and set up the system that really, really matters. What's important is the design, the structure, and the organization. So take a look at these. If I dropped you into this file structure, because this is the only thing I had available to me and you were my student, I hope it's fair to say it would be fairly easy for you to see, to be able to navigate without strenuous instructions from me. And we'll talk about kind of the instruction piece in a second, but if I said to you, go ahead and go into your week 1 folder, and then once you go into the week 1 folder, you see weekly schedule, checklist, vocabulary words. The instructions there seem fairly seamless, and simple, right? And so your student is not going to be thinking about where was I supposed to go, where. So think about your structure and keep it simple. I once heard a quote, and it's about, the more complicated things are, the simpler the solution we need to be finding, right? The more we're going to be introducing to our students, because this is as new to them as it is to you all, right? The simpler and easier we need to be making these kinds of systems. All right, so my next recommendation is to resist the temptation of diving right into curriculum at the beginning of the school year. Because remember how I told you that tech has a funny way of creeping in and stealing the limelight from your teaching? Like I mentioned, this is new to your students too, and establishing those norms and those behaviors and what it is, how you would like them to interact in your digital classroom is now more important than ever. They'll never get past the glitches, finding the instructions, understanding how a system how to use a system if we don't develop the habits in them intentionally. So instead, my recommendation is to use the first couple of weeks to intentionally integrate the technology and the habits, right, into your students by making it part of your lessons. This will save you and them, right, time and frustration up front, right, than when it really matters, right? So we know students want to do well. They want to be engaged, but if they can't get past the first level, which is going to be using the technology and becoming accustomed to how we're going to have to teach in the fall, they'll stay stuck there. So make it low stakes at the beginning of the school year by teaching them the tech. So how do we do that? We do that by teaching students to navigate the technology you'll be using in your classroom, which, like I said, will allow the rest of the school year to move more seamlessly, right? And again, you don't necessarily have to teach all the technology up front. If you are going to add a new system, so you're going to use iReady in the second quarter, but not the first one, no need to teach them that now. The principle still stands, right? When you're going to introduce a new piece of technology, take time to introduce the use of the technology. So at the beginning of the year, right, rather than content-specific tasks, have them practice whatever digital tools you'll be using and weave in the social emotional skills you would typically be embedding in your classroom. So, of course, depending on your student's age and subject, that's gonna vary. But the idea that you spend time thinking about what the digital skills and the social emotional skills they're gonna need to be successful in this new classroom, right? And creating the lessons around that will foster the kind of learning environment that you're going to want to have follow you throughout the rest of the year. So let's say you're teaching in the middle grades and you're looking to build in personal responsibility skills in your students. You've decided to use Google Classrooms, let's say, as your main classroom hub. During the first week, show them where they can expect to find the resources, where they can expect to find their assignments, how to open an assignment, how to read the instructions, where to read the instructions, how to submit, right? And when you provide them feedback, how they'll be able to receive feedback in your classroom. Then reinforce the learning by having them complete those actions. And here's what'll happen, right? It doesn't have to be for a grade. What will happen is once they start butting up against some of those issues, oh, I didn't know how to submit the assignment. Oh, I didn't realize that the assignment closed at 6 p.m. or at 11 p.m., right? Then you'll be able to reinforce, okay, keep in mind, we're in a new kind of classroom, right? And all the different things that they're gonna need, again, to long-term be able to thrive in your classroom. So now take a moment, right? So you can put it in the chat or you can write it down in your notebook. I'm a writer in notebooks, so that's what I do. Take a moment and think about all the other technology-based specifics to your classroom that you may need to be covering in the first couple of weeks, and jot those down. Go ahead, I'll wait a couple seconds. All right, how many of you all wrote synchronous meetings, Zoom or whatever tool you're going to be using? So I'm familiar with Zoom, so I'm going to use Zoom interchangeably with the idea of a synchronous conferencing tool, right? But how many of you, when you first started to do that in the spring, started to really not be happy about the situation, right? There's so much with that one tool what you're looking for is for it to be more than one way, right? So if all we're doing is lecturing on content, then sure, for the most part, if we do some tech-based things at the beginning, right, we mute everybody's microphone and then we just start to deliver content. All right, maybe not so hard. I mean, it's still a little hard on the psyche, but maybe not so hard. But we recognize that's not what's happening in our classrooms. And so building those skills, both the tech-based skills, how to mute and unmute my own mic, how to raise my hand, depending on the age of the child. Maybe you don't want to teach them how to do the functionality. Maybe you want to moderate how you mute and unmute their mics because they are younger. So you want them to raise their hand so you can visually see it on camera. Go ahead and think about your experience from the last spring. And think about what rules you might change or what rules you might, or guidelines, right, for interactions in your synchronous classrooms you would implement. And while you think about that, I am going to switch my background. Let's see if I manage to do this without breaking anything. There we are. All right. So this one, although I'll move this way. Yep, there it is. So I wanted to kind of, while we did this activity, put up a couple of rules, because what I want you to think about next is, once you have your set of guidelines for your students, how are you going to teach them, right? And practice with them how it is that you want them to interact in your virtual classroom during your synchronous sessions. So this I wanted to put up here to kind of give you as an idea. Typically in our classrooms, right? So we put up the class rules, or what are the norms, or in our learning environment, this is the way that we behave. Think about how your classroom now might look different. And this might be one of the ways, right, that we can reinforce how it is that we want students to interact when we are in these synchronous sessions. And now think about your discipline, right? So let's say that based on what you teach, you do Socratic seminars, right? So those have nuances in the way that we interact. So maybe you want to remind them that we ask questions, we don't, whatever that might look like. The one thing tech can sometimes do for us, right, is it can give us the ability to change a couple of things fairly quickly. So you can have these and establish those norms. And then depending on whether or not today's synchronous session is small group work, I have the small group rules up there, right? So think about what that's going to be. Now, back to our brainstorm, and I will take this off because it will distract me. There it is. All right. So back to our brainstorming. What learning activities could we do with students, right, to reinforce and teach this learning? How did you create that background in Zoom? It came out so clear. This one's easy. Canva.com, canva.com. That's actually their stock template. After they have Zoom backgrounds, and then you can add it into there. And you can form those give free accounts. So, and that one is the Zoom backgrounds is part of the free account. So go ahead and do that. All right. So here you have some learning activities, right, that you can engage in your classroom to start teaching your students how to act in your synchronous class sessions, right? So review the Zoom room rules. Let's say that you, and you know, again, depending on your material, depending on what it is that you're going to be doing in your synchronous sessions, which we'll talk about in a minute, you can demonstrate how to mute and unmute the mic functionality, right? And make these things fun, right? Maybe you get one of those buzzards, right? And when you see, and this happens to all of us. I mean, I unfortunately do Zooms all day, and sometimes we'll start talking and that, Gabby, you're on mute, you know, so this is something that really is kind of, it'll take time, but do it, make it fun, right? If they forget to mute their mic, maybe you make a different sound effect. Again, of course, age appropriate and depending on what you teach. But yeah, demonstrating the functionality, essentially taking all your teaching principles and applying them to these tech-based skills. Have a practice discussion, right? One of the things we talk about, we're going to talk about, is building community. And a lot of the things my colleagues tell me is that they feel that they'll have a missed opportunity to really bond with their students. And to that, I say the same thing I always say, right? It can happen online. It just has to be intentional, right? So take these first 2 weeks to do those things. Practice those tech-based tools. And here in the practice discussion, maybe you ask them, maybe you're gonna have a 30-minute discussion on what they did in the summer, and you're gonna tell them what they did in the summer, and you're gonna start to establish your teaching presence and connection, right? While you teach them to use the tech tools. And a skit activity, right? So we want to teach them to, we want to give them an opportunity to get to know their classmates as well. So maybe we break them out into groups, and you ask them to create a skit of them either breaking one of the rules or abiding by one of the rules, and then the class has to grade, right? We talk a little bit about this later, but what this also does for you all as the educator is give you a low stakes form of being able to practice the technology. So it's almost like you're teaching them, and you're also giving yourself a safe opportunity to be able to learn how to use the tech tools themselves, right? Because I know there's nothing more frustrating. And I think that's what added to some of the frustration in the spring, right? You were already in your groove. You were already knee deep into the curriculum that you were going to teach them by the end of the year. And at this point, it was kind of like a bam, just a big halt, right? And it didn't, because you were kind of already in this forward momentum, taking step backs really kind of made it more frustrating. And especially taking steps back when you're feeling like, I don't know how to use these things, right? Give yourself the opportunity in these safe first couple of weeks to make them comfortable with it and make yourself comfortable with it, right? So I challenge you that while you're teaching them, you're teaching yourself, right? How do you set up groups? How do you make that seamless, right? But also in a very low stakes kind of way, teaching them, giving them an opportunity to develop socially in your classroom, but also giving yourself a safe opportunity to be able to learn how to maneuver the tech. All right. Now let's talk about parents. Parents are also adjusting to this new way of doing school. And let's face it, I am a parent, can sometimes be worse than the students. But in this upside down, we need them to play an even more prominent role in supporting their child's learning. So we're gonna need to give them more support as well. So here are a few tips. Remember how we said we would establish one consistent location? This should also be the same place where parents can find information. They'll do a better job at reinforcing your expectations and following through on their end if it's easy for them to navigate. Not to mention, it'll reduce the number of emails and calls that you're going to get asking for clarification on what it is that they're supposed to be doing or what systems they're supposed to be going to, right? So this is where I go back to the one hub. When my kids, when virtual school happened, right, there was a lot of different systems that they were using. And so I spent the first, and I like to think, although I don't know, maybe some of my colleagues will throw me under the bus and say otherwise, I like to think that I'm tech savvy. And I spent a good 2 weeks trying to figure out, wait, is that the grammar app, or is that the reading one? Or where do they do this thing and where, right? If you have all that information in one hub, right, where this is this application and this is where the grammar happens, this is, right, I always know where to go, and it's all neatly labeled. I know where to find it. What that'll do is, not for all parents, but let's hope for the majority of parents, it will allow them to problem solve on their own before they're sending you an email asking you, where is it that I find that again? Give weekly updates. Weekly updates are a good way to keep everyone informed about what's going on in your class. Give the students and the parents the same information to reduce confusion. Again, since you've chosen that one platform, they should both be going to the same place. Now, when I talk to my friends about this, they'll say, well, Gabby, one of the things that I like to teach in the middle grades is personal responsibility. So I write the homework here, and if they write it down, they write it down. And if they don't, they need to be learning those lessons. Agreed, 100%. But remember, the fact that they're having to log into a system, that they're having to find your homework assignment, right? That still requires personal responsibility and action, right? And so it's not, yes, sure, there are some parents out there who will do it for them, right? But the idea is, if you're giving the parents different information or structuring it differently, or it sounds differently, then it's going to cause confusion, right? So I'm going to be having debates with my kids, and now we're going to add a new email into your inbox. And remember, I want you to keep your time on instruction, not logistics, right? So give them the same information and send them to the same place. Be mindful of your naming conventions. For example, if you are going to be using email, right, for communication, or how you'll structure your learning management system, don't name things like general things like weekly update, right? Because the weekly update is going to have a digest of a few things, but by the time we're in week 7, there's been 7 weekly updates. And I'm looking for this one piece of communication because I remember that you said at the end of the semester, of the quarter, we were going to have to complete a project. When I write weekly updates, all these emails from this year, from last year, from all the weekly updates we've ever gotten, right, are going to pop in there, right? So be mindful of your naming conventions, and remember how tech is searchable, right? So if they are the Hispanic Heritage Project Instructions, name it Hispanic Heritage Project Instructions, right? So that it makes it easier on the student and the parent, and hopefully avoid an extra layer of communication that then I'll have to, the parent will have to send to you to ask for the instructions again. Set clear expectations and boundaries for communication. This one is a big one that I talk to faculty here all the time, and I will share with you all. Tech, because it's on us, it's on our watch, it's on our laptop, we're at home now all the time, it has a way of just kind of becoming part of our lives, right? And if we're not really disciplined about it, it's going to make you feel like you need to be connected all the time. My advice to you is make yourselves, whatever time you are available to parents, make that information available to them. Set the boundaries and the expectations. Let them know how long it will take you to check email, right? Let them know when they can expect, or how they can expect to receive communication from you. Because if not, think about it. Let's say you have 25 kids in your class, and now you're getting, half of them are sending you emails. You're going to be responding to those things for 24 hours, right? 24/7. So avoid burnout by setting those expectations. Here's another one that I'll give you. It does come from higher ed. I know when you all in school will remember this, office hours. So faculty members here do office hours for students. Maybe you consider doing office hours for parents, right? So depending on what the instructional schedule might look like, you might do direct instruction, synchronous instruction in the morning, and then in the afternoon, you're available for your students. Make yourself available to parents as well. You don't necessarily have to do this during the whole school year, but I definitely recommend that you do it in the first couple of weeks, right? Because that's when everyone's going to be getting used to the different systems, tools, and ways in which you'll be teaching. Give them an opportunity to ask you a question. Get all these communications and kinks out of the way up front, so that then after the second or third week, you can start into your curriculum understanding that everyone knows what the expectations are. Again, create a backup plan for off hours and tech support. If parents or students need help outside of the regular school hours, who can they contact? If you are the single point of contact, and I recognize that may be the case, what I recommend is upfront, let them know what your parameters are going to be. you can let them know and say, if you start to experience technical issues or you have some sort of concern after 6 p.m., feel free to send me an email. I will address it in the morning, right? This way, right? We know we have some anxious folks out there. So this way they're not sending you 5 emails saying, but it's due at 11 o'clock and my kid can't get into it, right? Let them know and give yourself some flexibility here, right? I know that part of some of the social emotional skills we want to be teaching, right, is the discipline and the rigor of understanding deadlines and timelines. But right now is kind of, again, an upside down time. So demonstrating flexibility, not only for them, but for yourself, right, is a good practice. All right, developing connections with our students is very important. In online instruction, we talk a lot about design because the archetypes of face-to-face instruction are sometimes weaved so deeply that we forget to notice them, right? So for example, when we're in the classroom, we have a lot of organic opportunities for our students to see us and ask us questions and get clarification on concepts, or perhaps expectations on a project. Sometimes this happens at the end of the day, depending on what your day is structured like. Sometimes at the end of the day when they're writing things down in their agenda. Sometimes in the middle grades or high school, they'll pop into your classroom during lunch or a free period. In the digital space, we don't exactly have that kind of flexibility or maneuverability, right? So the idea is not to discount the value of those interactions, but then figure out how you can coordinate them and plan them so that they are still available to your students. We recognize that in this upside down, it's what I'm going to keep calling it. I kind of refuse to call it the new normal. So in this upside down, we know that our students are also going through a lot, right? So I would venture to say being available to them on a more connection level is going to be critical, right? So think about what you might be able to squeeze into the schedule, right? Depending on how your school or school system is doing instruction. Now, I know that that can be tricky, right? So here are a couple of things that I can kind of recommend. Establish new classroom rituals. Maybe you send them a weekly video message every Monday morning, reminding them of just some, major things they should be aware of, and also some positive reinforcement, right? And I know that saying things like, maybe you make them a video is really kind of far out of what you might be your comfort zone. It doesn't have to be produced. It doesn't have to be super fancy. It could really be you in your own Zoom room saying, hi, everybody. We made it through the 3rd week of virtual learning. And gosh, I miss being able to hug each and every one of you. But we're making it through, and I'm seeing that all of you are getting accustomed to the new norm. I just want to tell you, we'll make it through together. If you need anything, remember that my office hours are on Tuesday between 12 and 1. I hope to see you there. That's it. That's it, right? It doesn't have to be something, but what it starts to do, right? It solidifies your instructor presence in their lives in a way, in a time where they don't necessarily have access to you and your shine and your personality and your glow, right? Like they used to. If you were a teacher, that lets students have lunch in your classroom to go over concepts or before the school day started or after the school day started, and I'm going to give a shout out to Mr. Gupta from my high school who got me through honors physics that way, right? Set those up, right? You don't have to do it every day. Maybe you're doing it on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and maybe you teach algebra. I was terrible at that too. So maybe you teach algebra. Let them know if you need any extra help, come in during these times, right? Depending, and of course, coordinate that with what your instructional schedule looks like for your school so that you know that they're available and you're available. But again, this might start to give students a different access, or the same access they would get to you face-to-face, but now in our virtual world. And finally, think about what school-wide or grade-wide efforts you can design in. And I know that this one is tough, and I know that this changes from school to school, right? But give some creative thought to that. And I know that I have some administrators out there, right? Creativity needs to be happening in the way that we do our things in the classroom, but in the administration too, right? So don't discount these opportunities now, but maybe rethink them, right? Maybe there's, maybe counselors, school counselors can be doing some self-care sessions, right? Maybe they can be giving us mindful meditation techniques after school, right? Build some of those opportunities in there, right? To continue to create an atmosphere of community, but also give students and teachers an opportunity to interact outside of the instruction. All right, so let's shift a little bit into instruction now. While there's still a lot that's uncertain, I think it's pretty safe to bet that most teachers will be doing some form of virtual teaching. Maybe it'll be completely virtual, maybe in some sort of a hybrid model, but one thing's for sure, the virtual aspect is no longer something we're gonna get dropped into, right? So let's look at ways you can better prepare for the uncertainty of what the schedule might look like or what the instruction might look like, right? And think about ways that we can approach teaching to make it more resilient. Depending on what your school system has decided, and regardless of fully virtual or the hybrid model, at the core of the disruption is the way we typically teach and what we do with our students synchronously and asynchronously, right? So while I have some tips in this area, the most important thing I want you to ask yourself continuously, right, as you develop or as you take your lessons that you've built over years of practice and think about how you do that next year, ask yourself, when do your students need you the most? And the answer to that, right, should guide your lesson designs, right? So when would they need you present the most and guide the synchronous, asynchronous, virtual time on their own, right? That way. For a lot of us, when we move to virtual teaching, we continue to deliver direct instruction, right? Presentations, lectures, synchronously in an attempt to recreate the in-class experience and ask students to complete a lot of the learning activities asynchronously. Today, I want to pitch to you the idea of flipping your classroom. Now, I know that many of you have heard this strategy. In fact, in higher ed, we borrowed this teaching methodology from you all as it's a concept that was born out of Colorado by 2 high school science teachers, right? But I want to say that this teaching strategy has a lot of resilience built into it for this day and time, but also always, right? So basically, the concept of a flipped classroom is this: that which is traditionally done in the class synchronously is now done at home asynchronously, and that which is traditionally done as homework is now completely done in class. But why? Okay, well, I can think of a few reasons that are tightly connected to the situation we're in today, right? We have very little control of their learning environment right now, right? They might be logged on, but they might be texting, or they might be distracted by their other siblings in the house, or they might not be logged on at the time that you are giving them direct instruction, right? Because there's one computer in the home and they're sharing it. So a lot of different factors, right, that play a role in what's happening today. By recording the direct instruction piece, you've given the student now the ability to engage in that direct instruction piece on their own time. Now, a hallmark of the flipped classroom is not to say, okay, well, watch this video, right? And then I'll see you in class. No, we have to teach our students, right, to take ownership of the learning. And again, this changes depending, I get that, right, depending on the age group, right? But ask them to be active participants in the watching portion of it, right? But it does a couple of other things. For example, if you do your direct instruction during your 1-hour synchronous session, and let's say you're covering a math concept on Monday, you went through it once, but depending on what the schedule might look like, you may not have synchronous time again until Thursday. But they have a lot of different assignments that they need to be completing, right, to that concept. They're going to have very little opportunity to double check, to double check whether or not they grasp the concept correctly, right? Having a video of the direct instruction piece, right, allows them to pause you, rewind you, watch you again, right? It gives them an opportunity to adapt, right, their to adapt their learning to suit their pace. And then what do we do in the synchronous time? Well, in the synchronous time, we're going to do guided practice. In the synchronous time, we are going to be available to them when they need us the most, right? So let's say that you are teaching the quadratic formula. I don't even remember the quadratic formula, but let's say you're teaching the quadratic formula. You do the direct instruction piece, right, in a video demonstration. You ask them, right, so, and be creative, right? Gabby, they're not gonna watch my video. They will if you ask them to, and they will if you hold them accountable to it, right? So drop an Easter egg in there, right? Say, you'll have to, once you watch the video, there's one problem in the video that you'll have to submit before our next synchronous class, right? So now you know that they're gonna have to engage in the video and you're going to be able to see what they did and didn't do. So remember, you ask them to take an active participation in their learning. So they watch the video and now they come to your synchronous class, right? Let's say that Easter egg you dropped in there, the first 10 minutes, you go over that problem that you embedded in your video, in your demonstration video on how to complete the quadratic equation. Then the next, let's say 30 minutes of your synchronous class time, right? You break them up into groups and you give them 3 more problems to complete as groups with a higher degree of difficulty. And now you're moving through the different rooms, offering your support or guidance on where they get stuck. And then let's say the last piece of the class time, you move everyone back together in the main room and you go over the concept once again, and letting them know that you'll now assign them a higher degree of difficulty in the assignments during their synchronous time, right? But what did that do? If I'm not grasping the concept and I'm sitting by myself at home, right, I'm stuck. I have no one to ask. I mean, I could write you an email, right? But the likelihoods that the student might do that, right, maybe are high achievers, but the majority of our students are gonna be like, I think it's right, and then they're gonna be done, right? Being there in the moment when they're getting frustrated with the material, right, so that you can walk them through it, that's a more resilient way to do it. In addition, you know, maybe they are not able to log on. Maybe, you know, God forbid they get sick, right? Now they at least have an opportunity to be able to catch up or review if they weren't able to be in your synchronous class times. So think about it, right? It's a more engaging way also of answering the question of when it is that your students need you the most. All right, plan and practice your synchronous sessions. Let's face it, tech can be fickle. So here's my advice. Practice and do the setup ahead of time. I know, you know, it's a new world, but the truth of the matter is tech and education, right, is not something that's going to go away, and it's certainly not going to go away after this, right? So take the time, right, to make yourself comfortable with that piece so you're not dealing with the frustration of it not working out, if it's not working out when you're in the middle of your class time. And also, right, have patience with yourself. No one ever got good at something by doing it once. So if it doesn't go well the first time, try again the next time, right? Don't just, so frustrated, right? And ask for help. You know, we have some colleagues that are more tech savvy than others, and I'm gonna drop my information at the end of the presentation. So if you're really, really frustrated, reach out, right? But have patience with yourself. And finally, remind yourself that teaching and learning is an iterative process. If something doesn't work, reflect on your approach and how you can improve on it, right? Ask your students for feedback. Where did you lose them? Take that information and try again. Again, be kind to yourself as you grow in this aspect of your teaching, right? But be persistent, right? Be persistent with your iteration. All right. In continuing to think about what we do synchronously and asynchronously, I want to introduce you to DFINC's Castle Talk template. This comes from a larger body of knowledge centered around designing courses for significant learning in the higher ed space. In this model, Dr. Fink asks us to make a distinction between teaching techniques, right, which is what we're really familiar with, and the idea of an overall instructional strategy. Essentially, Dr. Fink asks us as teachers to think about creating an overall instructional strategy by giving careful consideration to the sequencing, right, of the teaching techniques and learning activities that the students complete, so as that the energy for learning, right, increases and accumulates as the students go through your sequence, right, as they progress through your lesson. I used this model a few weeks ago when I was designing my blended course for this fall, which similar to what I imagine a lot of you all are thinking through right now. It's half-time in person or synchronously, and then half-time fully online. It helped me in determining what activities I did in class when I was present to guide them and facilitate their learning, and then what they did outside of class when I wasn't there face-to-face to be able to, or in real time, right, to be able to guide them. Using this template allowed me to visualize a sequence of the learning activities and my students' progression towards achieving the objectives. And I found myself kind of moving things around, right, because if I needed to be more in person at the beginning because the concepts were more difficult, right, then maybe more self-paced stuff, right, it allowed me to move those things, those activities, my teaching techniques around to be able to see the sequence of how the students were not only going to engage in the content, right, but engage with me as their teacher. So in preparing my time for today, I adapted that version of the template a little bit in the hopes that maybe it would help you all visualizing how to sequence your teaching techniques and learning activities while being mindful, right, of the situational factor today of synchronicity and asynchronicity for instruction. So of course, depending on your synchronous, asynchronous schedule, the format of this template might need to be adapted. But the idea is that this kind of a worksheet allows you to sketch out what happens in the room when you're in the room and what happens when you're not in the room. Remembering that the goal is to create a sequence of activities that build on one another while ensuring that you're there in real time when your students need you the most. So I'm not saying now, let's say that you are a veteran teacher and you've been teaching for 50 years and your lessons are well constructed, they work, you've done this again for years. I'm not saying you toss that out the window and start new. I'm saying you take those lessons that you've learned, right? And you start to see where you would be putting, all right, so if typically I was having them do this kind of homework because the very next day I was able to go over them and reinforce the learning, would I move this during my synchronous class time? Because then I'll be able to find out sooner whether or not they're capturing the concepts. And so what you'll do is almost kind of look again at the sequence of your instructional strategy to determine what can be moved asynchronous and what should be done synchronously. All right, our time is almost up, but of course we should talk a little bit about assessment and feedback. Remember what I said about good teaching? The idea of providing students with ample formative assessments and the opportunity for practice is not new or novel. We know that learning science tells us that it produces the most learning gains. That does not change in the virtual environment, right? But in the virtual environment, it does make it, depending on the tools you're using, right? It does make it a little bit easier for us to embed formative assessment and be able to look in real time, right? How our students are doing, right? So one of the things that I want to, and I tried in the design of our time today, not to be too tool specific, recognizing that, we have folks from across the nation today. And so, the situations might be different, but I wanted to, in this particular place, point out in the presentation, that if you are in a learning management system, or perhaps you're using Google Classrooms, right, you can build assessments in there. And I know that it's new to you or maybe new to you, but I'm going to encourage you to build formative assessments in there, right? So that in real time, you don't have to assign a grade. Maybe it's just an assignment, right? What you would typically maybe do during class time, but you'll be able to see the analytics in real time, which should then kind of move your decision making of what you need to be slowing down on, or what you should be going back content-wise again, going over. Remember how I told you, Did I tell you? Remember how I told you that, we need to slow down the pace in online a little bit more than we might necessarily do it in person because of all the other situational factors, right? But embedding a lot of formative assessments, right, into your teaching practice right now will start to inform you, right, where your students may be hitting some road bumps and then where you might want to go back again. As it pertains to feedback, a lot of these tools allow you to embed the feedback into the design of the assessment, right? So that if maybe it's just a 5-question assessment, but if they get it wrong, you can put in there, no, not precisely, not exactly correct. Go back to the conversation about Benedict Arnold and what he did during the Civil War. No, that was before. That was, yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. All the history teachers out there cringing. All right, so that's your pro tip in terms of formative assessments. Build them in there, right? And then start to use them to refine what you're doing in your synchronous and asynchronous class times, and build the feedback straight into there. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about summative assessments. When the switch first happened, I remember checking in on my brilliant friend, Michael Bonner, who's an educator at the Ron Clark Academy. And I was curious about what he might be struggling with, given that this was a little bit more my world. Well, the distance education part, right? Wondered if I could be of any support. And he shared with me that his frustration at the time, right, was that he thought maybe his 6th graders were sharing or collaborating on some assessments for vocabulary, right? And so in the higher ed space, we do have a lot of tools that we use to curb cheating. But I recognize that those tools, well, they're very costly, right? And you all, because of good teaching, do a lot more assessing than we might be doing, right? But anyway, so while that's available, but most places not, you all aren't using it, and also exam versioning is possible. My best pedagogically sound recommendation in this realm is to, in the summative assessments, ask them to create something, right? So let's take that example of vocabulary, right? In your formative assessments, right? So let's say you take a week and a half or 2 weeks to go through a vocabulary lesson. Make formative assessment checkpoints, right? That look like what our typical exams might look like, right? The identifying, the being able to define. So your multiple choice, your fill in the blanks, your write a sentence, right? Build those in as formative assessments. But your final assessment on the content, ask them to write a vignette or a small story utilizing the vocabulary words, or the majority of the vocabulary words, or however you design the assessment, right? While it doesn't make it impossible for our students to collaborate, right? It does make it more difficult, right? And so think about what your discipline is and what it is that you're teaching, and then move the learning objective, right, to the application portion and test their knowledge when you get to the summative assessment in that fashion. All right. So to close our time, I want to leave you with this. Last year, I was lucky enough to go to the ISTE conference. It's the International Society for Technology and Education conference. If you're not familiar, this organization is actually primarily geared for K-12 and not necessarily higher ed. But I really wanted to go because I tend to see a lot more innovation in educational technology in the K-12 space. And then I look to kind of take some of those and adapt them into the higher ed space, right? So that's where I went. When I went there, it was wild. I've gone to big conferences. Their vendor center dwarfed most conferences that I've been to for higher ed. And while it was very exciting and fascinating, the thing that kind of left me a little bit unsettled is the idea that sometimes in technology, and that's what I do, right? We tend to kind of grasp a lot of things because we need technology. It's virtual. It has to be online. Your evidence-based teaching practices should guide the design of your digital classroom. Don't be seduced by all the fancy bells and whistles. If we don't integrate them into your virtual classroom in a way that's pedagogically sound, the learning gains won't be there, right? So it's a tough time, and there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of different tools coming at us, right? Go easy on yourself. Stick to what you know in terms of good pedagogical evidence-based instruction, and then add tech tools that make either your role as the educator, right, makes it seamless or more efficient, or does reinforce the learning for the student in a pedagogically sound way, right? Don't kill yourself trying to figure it all out, right? Rely on your teaching strategy first. So pedagogy first, technology second. I hope you found value in this crash course. There's so much more to share about the distance education world, right? Equity, accessibility practices, specific use of tech tools, how to do this in an ELA classroom versus a STEM-based classroom, right? But there just isn't enough time. But what I can provide you, right? You'll see my contact information on there. I love a good challenge. So if you're really frustrated or you're really kind of like, there's no way I can do that online, let me know, right? I won't have all the answers, but we can do a call. I don't know that there's anything that between your know-how, right, that we couldn't think through. So there's my contact information. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to leave that for like 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. And then I'm going to put up here the next 3 webinars that we have put together for you all. The team got together and kind of did a big brainstorm of what we think might be beneficial to you all. But, and we did ask colleagues in the K-12 space, but if there's something out there that you're thinking you could totally benefit from that you'd like us to consider, here's the email address again. Send it to us, and we'll try to put it together. We're really excited that we were able to kind of put this together and be able to be a resource to you all. I think sometimes in terms of how we do education, we tend to separate higher ed and K-12, but there's so much learning we can do from one another. And so thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we keep in touch.
Thank you, Gabby, for your insights today. So our chat and Q&A have been very active. We've answered almost, over 40 questions, but I've gathered some that address some of the common themes that I'm sure our teachers would like to hear you address. So the first one that we're getting a lot of questions on is videos. What program would you recommend to make a video? Or what program would you recommend to record direct instructional videos?
Okay. That's a great question. And the good news is that next week on July 29th, there is an entire session dedicated to exactly answering that question. But here's what I'm going to tell you, right? Yes, there are videos, instructional videos that can be produced in studios that are beautiful and clear and crisp and magical, right? And there's what we have today, right? Within the living constraints that we're in, right? So maybe you're doing this at home, which is how we tailored next week's presentation. Here's what I'm gonna tell you. If you're using Zoom, you can create an instructional video in Zoom. You open your Zoom room and it's just you. You can upload your presentation. You can make it so that your video is in there and you're recording those pieces. Let's say that you are in STEM-based instruction or math, right? I have a trick for that. Let's say you're using Zoom. I have a trick for it, but don't get mad at me if the technology, maybe you can borrow the added technology from the school. Sign in with an iPad, right? You're signed in twice, right? And on one, you're using the whiteboard to work it out, and on the other, right, you're recording the camera piece, right, so that you are looking into the video and the student is seeing your affect, and at the same time, you can see what you're writing here and instructing them to do it. There's so many ways to do this, right? So like I said, Michael's gonna cover that and I don't even want to necessarily dive into it, but what I do want to tell you is this. The camera on your iPhones is really great too. it's really a matter of positioning, right? So instead of kind of selfing the camera, right, there's very cheap stands that will kind of, oh, now you'll see that it's an inspirational quote, but you'll be able to, it holds it here, and so you're able to deliver this way. I know this is going to sound weird. Don't make it perfect. None of us are perfect in our classrooms, and that's part of the connection we end up building with our students, right? We want to model who we are in this video, so don't put so much pressure on the perfection of it, right? Put more pressure on the instruction of it. What are you trying to communicate? What are your learning goals? And then achieving those in the instructional video.
Great. So Gabby, you gave me a really good example of this the other day. And one of our teachers wants to know, what are ways in how a flip can look like for kinder?
Yay, I did answer. Well, we did have a conversation about this the other day. Okay, so I'll give you the specific example that was shared, the specific example of a kindergarten teacher that was shared with me, and kind of how I addressed that. So I was talking to a colleague, and her brother-in-law is a kindergarten teacher, and he is concerned about when he's teaching language, right? The pronunciation of the vowels and consonants, and right, the sounds. Here's a trick about a flipped classroom. The flipped classroom doesn't necessarily mean that all the instruction happens on video, right? Or meaning that they're only consuming the video on their own time. Have them, so in kinder, right? So let's talk about the pronunciation of the vowels in acquiring language, right? Create those videos on what the A sound looks like, and then reinforce the use of that video in your synchronous class session, and now have them practice. Now, one thing I didn't want to dive into too much because the complexity of it might make it difficult is, depending on what your instructional schedule looks like, if you have any wiggle room in cutting up your classrooms even further, do that, right? Especially I would say, especially in the early childhood setting, right? So that if you have a classroom of 20, if maybe you figure how, you do 10 and 10, because then what you can be doing, right, is to say, okay, we're going to go over the A sound, you review the video together, but then you unmute each one and say, all right, now you do it, right? So we're going to kind of say to modeling some of those pieces. What other examples can we have? Well, I mean, listen, remember, I am not a K-12 educator. I am a learning designer, right? So I rely on you all, right, the subject matter expert, to tell me what you're trying to accomplish, so that I can help you kind of think about how to accomplish that, right? But I do have kids, so this is the lens I'm going to share that with you. A lot of what's happening in that age, right, is the social emotional pieces of it. And I tend to believe that the learning will catch itself up. Don't beat yourself up for not having them know the entire alphabet or whatever learning games they need to be doing in the first 3 months during this time, right? Give them a safe environment, continue to open their appetite for learning, right? We know that if we start to dim that thirst for acquiring knowledge, right, that carries with them throughout the years. So really take your time to pace some of those pieces out is probably the best advice that I have for you today. But if you want to get with me and send me something specific, like this is usually what I do in my classroom because this is what I'm trying to achieve, I am game to think it through with you.
So the last question that I'm sure a lot of our teachers are feeling, I'm not sure if I'm going to be teaching in person or remotely. Is there anything I should be doing right now to prepare for any last minute shifts in my teaching modality?
So that's, that's one of the reasons why I want to say that thinking about what your lessons have looked like and then considering flipping your classroom or creating, or maybe not necessarily the entire methodology of flipping, but I'm certainly encouraging that you maybe start to take some time to develop some instructional videos, right? Is precisely that. We don't know. And we don't know that whether or not, we'll be back in the classroom and then suddenly shifted back into virtual world. So here's what my recommendations to you all are. I would start with a digital space either way. So I'm planning a classroom for a class for the fall. I'm planning for, and no firm decisions have been made as of yet, given that I'm in Miami-Dade County, so things are rapidly changing. I'm building my hub, my main hub, as if I were having to go fully online. Worst case scenario, I've over communicated with my students and I can, mute things or take them out. Best case scenario, I'm already kind of prepared, right? Where the instructional videos kind of come in is also the flexibility of understanding that you or your students may be in and out of the classroom in different ways. I would tend to think about my first, let's say, 5 weeks in the classroom that way. The piece that we talked about today about teaching them the technology, it's a piece that I find even when we're doing face-to-face instruction, through my experience with students, is something we don't take the time to do. But then it puts us as educators in that position where we're answering 50,000 emails about like, where do I reset my password? And where do I do these things? I would integrate that into my classroom today, whether you are, whether we're talking 2 years from now or whether we're talking right now in the fall, right? It will save you a lot of administrative time as an educator. So I would definitely do that. I would definitely pick a hub, a main hub of communication, and design at least template what those pieces would look like. And I would definitely start giving some serious consideration on how I am going to establish my teaching presence with my students, regardless of modality, right? Recognizing whether it's remote or whether it's in person, that the way we do things is going to be differently, right? To that example about pronunciation, right? When we're teaching language, if we're back in the classroom, we would venture to say either way, we might be wearing masks, right? Which makes it kind of hard for you to see how I'm moving my mouth, right? So the idea of creating the instructional video still stands when we speak about resiliency and how you design your lessons. Because now I may be in the classroom wearing my mask, but I'm gonna show you the video, right? And so those are the kinds of things that, and it's tough, right? Because it is a different lens to look at things, but the more setup that you can accomplish now in thinking about your digital classroom, the easier it might be depending on what situation you'll be in the fall.
Okay. So we're concluding our first session. We thank you all for all the participation in the chat, in the Q&A. We hope to see you at the next sessions, and I will answer a couple questions about the slides and the certificate of participation. So the slides and the recording will be made available on our website. When they are, we will email everyone that registered and let you know how to download it, and the certificate as well. So it'll be a certificate of participation, and it will include the time that you were here today. Again, thank you all. We're excited to see you in our next sessions, and we hope that you've gained some tips and tools that you can apply in this coming challenging school year.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everybody.